welcome back to another episode of Mood for Feud. I'm your host Katya, and today I am in the mood to cover the next installment in our Mommie, Dearest series. We are going to be talking about Jennette McCurdy and the complicated, tumultuous, and very complex relationship that she had with her mother. In the first episode of Mommie Dearest, we covered Ariel Winter, and I will have the link to that episode down below in the show notes. Also, I do want to give a quick trigger warning because there will be discussions about disordered eating, so definitely look after yourselves. And just as a general note, sometimes I forget to mention the trigger warnings when I'm recording, but I will always have them listed in the show notes, so just check those before you start an episode if there are certain topics that you would like to avoid. Remember, if you enjoy the show and would like to support it, then please do leave a rating. You can leave comments on Spotify, written reviews on Apple Podcast, and you can follow the show so you never miss an episode. I'm also on socials at Mood for Feud, and I'm always looking to chat pop culture, so send me a message there. Okay, I'm very interested to get into Jennette McCurdy. I feel like most people my age have really good memories of watching Jennette on Nickelodeon. She portrayed the character Sam Puckett alongside Miranda Cosgrove in iCarly, and then she also had the spin-off series called Sam and Cat, which was her alongside Ariana Grande. So very big names for people who grew up at the same time as me, and Jennette McCurdy was one of those actresses that was really captivating to watch, and especially her character Sam was very iconic, very recognizable, very funny, and just such a bright personality on our TV screens, which is so crazy to think about when you know about her abuse story, about the really quite intense and sad childhood that she had growing up. So it's always amazing to me when you find out information like this, because it just completely shatters everything that you thought you knew about someone. And I know it's silly to think that just because someone portrays a like happy, funny, bubbly person on TV, that's what they're going to be like in real life as well. To me, at least, there truly were no visible signs that Jennette was having a tough time. And this is quite different when you think about other child stars, and I guess I'm kind of thinking of someone like Macaulay Culkin. I guess he's a bit before her time, but there are signs there, right? Like you could kind of tell not everything is peaches there. But with Jennette McCurdy, I truly was so shocked and surprised to hear that her childhood wasn't great, because she spent so many years just being this really bright personality on all of our TV screens. And so I think that really shows how she was able to conceal a lot of that trauma that she was going through, and really making it seem like she was just someone living their best life. I mean, I never even really gave it a second thought, if I'm being honest. I never stopped and thought, I wonder if Jennette McCurdy's living a good life outside of iCarly, right? Because I think Miranda Cosgrove is like another child star who always seemed to be all okay. So yeah, I don't know. I just assumed the same of Jennette as well. So to prep for this episode, I did read Jennette's memoir, I'm Glad My Mum Died, which she released in 2022. And the book was incredibly successful. It sold out within 24 hours from retailers such as Amazon, Target, and Barnes & Nobles, and it was also featured on the New York Times bestseller list and has sold over 2 million copies. She dedicated the memoir to her brothers, who she is still really close with. She has 3 older brothers who obviously all experienced some of that same abuse that Jennette experienced. But her brothers have also since said that they were unaware of kind of the extent that Jennette was dealing with it, because their mum definitely had a like hyperfixation on Jennette. So although they were often caught in the crossfires of it, and they described that their mum would sometimes try and pit them against their sister, or, you know, start little like wars, I guess, amongst the siblings. In general though, they were unaware of how deep-seated and layered Jennette's relationship with their mother was. And I will say, it is a damn well-written memoir. And, you know, sometimes when you read these celebrity memoirs, it can be hit or miss. This is why I usually usually I say I prefer for them to use a ghostwriter. I know that might be controversial, but sometimes I think celebrities have interesting stories to tell and life experiences that, you know, I want to hear about and I want to read about, but then they're poorly written and it's like, oh my gosh. It's like a deal with the devil almost, where it's like the person with the most interesting experiences but doesn't have the skills to communicate them in an engaging way. If you're not a celebrity who is good at writing, that's fine. Just get a ghostwriter so that you can tell your story but we can read it in a fun way. But as far as I can tell, Jennette did not use a ghostwriter for this, or at least she's never mentioned using one. She did of course have an editor who she says helped her get the book into its, you know, final stages, but as far as I can tell, Jennette wrote this book herself, which I think makes it all the more impressive because it really is very well done, very well written. I think she mentioned she rewrote this maybe like 12 or 15 times to really flesh out the storyline and get all of her points across. And the book is kind of written as like a series of vignettes is how I would describe it, but it's definitely still a very easy storyline to follow. The book starts when Jennette is 6 years old, and then we continue through to her adulthood, and along the way we kind of get these glimpses or snippets into memories she recalls or just little moments that she describes, and they kind of move the story along. But all throughout, we really get a great idea of Jennette's childhood and how she grew up and the family around her and the relationship dynamics and of course her experiences with her mum. And the way it's all woven together like this, it's very impressive. It also, I feel like what really comes through with her memoir is that Jennette has done extensive therapy, because she's very good at, well, first of all, I think she is just a perceptive person, but outside of that, she's very good at understanding the experiences she's gone through, being able to kind of analyze them or recognize the depths and layers beneath them, and then communicate those outward again. And I think that kind of skill of being able to recall an experience, realize the meaning or impact behind it, and then relay it back to someone is typical to me of someone who has gone through therapy. And it's a very raw, honest, and emotional book. And she really didn't hold back, which I also appreciate, because that's pet peeve number 2 when it comes to celebrity memoirs, is when you know that they've been through some like crazy stuff and then they decide to just not tell you anything, or they redact a bunch of it, or they just give really vague details. And it's like, if you sit down and you're gonna convince me to pay money to read about your life, like make it fucking juicy. Like I don't want to sound like a bitch, but like I need the details if you're gonna sit down and do this. And in Jennette's case, she really does give the details, the good, the bad, the ugly. You know, parts of it were very difficult to read and pretty horrific, to be blunt, but I think they're important. They're an important part of the memoir. They give us an understanding as to who she is outside of just being Sam Puckett. And this is kind of the other revelation I had as I was reading this, is that I actually had no idea who the fuck Jennette McCurdy was. Because really when I think of her, I just think of her character, Sam Puckett. And I never, you know, she wasn't really a celebrity who did much outside of acting on Nickelodeon, and so yeah, I really just conflated those personalities, and there were all of these unknowns. I definitely recommend you check the book out if you haven't done so already, and I think she's done an amazing job at it. It's fantastic. And she does also reveal in the book that she did always want to be a writer. She actually wrote her first screenplay when she was a child, and she was very excited to share this with her mum, but her mum was pretty unhappy about it and told Jennette that writers have fat butts and look frumpy because they sit down all the time, and isn't it so much better to be an actress? So she was discouraged from pursuing writing for a really long time. I think this is incredibly sad, because as we see with this memoir, Jennette really does have a talent and a knack for writing, and I think part of that is because she is very perceptive and she's obviously talented. And given that she says she never really enjoyed acting and doesn't really like doing it, I think being a writer could be a very natural career step for her, or a new way to continue to work in the industry without doing something that she absolutely hates. So I really hope she does get more writing gigs following this, because I think she's definitely a very talented storyteller. Now, following the release of this memoir, Jennette did a massive press tour, and she's been on so many podcasts, talk shows. As I was researching, I was on YouTube looking up some of the podcasts that she guested on and stuff, and 10 other ones would be recommended for me to watch next. So she really did such a good job of putting this book out there, and then also sitting down and talking about these really heavy topics that she went through repeatedly, on so many different shows. So I'm just in awe. I'm absolutely in awe of how she was able to portray her story and then relive it over and over again. Particularly, I'll call out her interview with Louis Theroux on his podcast. I thought that one was incredible, and I am very biased because I do love Louis Theroux, and I think he is, well, OGs will remember that he was on my Hear Me Out cake. But then also, I think he is one of the most talented interviewers, and it was nice to hear this conversation between them. I also watched her interview on the Drew Barrymore show and the Red Table Talk that she did with Jada, Willow, and Adrian. Yeah, but she's been on so many more. And if there's any amazing ones that you've seen that stand out to you, please send them through, because I could listen to her talk forever. I think she's got such an eloquent way of being really authentic, but communicating quite clearly as well. I love listening to her. And I really hope it's been a healing journey for her. I hope that writing this book and talking about it, and she says she's processed so much of what she went through really intensive therapy, and I just wish the best for her. She reminds me a lot of Ariel Winter, in that they both seem like people that I could just go and have lunch with and have it just be an amazing conversation without feeling like I'm talking to a celebrity. They both seem very genuine, authentic, and down to earth. One more thing I'll mention, and then we will get into the episode, this is a very big intro, is that this will be a two-parter. Part 2 of this episode will be coming out in 2 weeks' time, and that is because next week I am moving. Hey, I am moving into a new apartment, which I'm very excited about, and I will be very busy. I just already know. So Part 2 will come out in 2 weeks' time, and next week will be a Mood for News bonus episode, because those are always much easier for me to throw together. That is enough yapping. Let's get into it. We are going to start with Jennette McCurdy's childhood and upbringing. So Jennette was born 26th of June 1992, and this makes her a Cancer, which is so on point. This is very unsurprising to me, because as I mentioned before, she is someone who is very perceptive and attuned to emotions, and very emotionally intellectual. You can just tell that she understands thoughts and feelings on that deeper level that Cancers often do. And her upbringing was definitely not glamorous. I would say that they were lower class in terms of financial situation. So in her household, she grew up with her parents, Deborah and Mark, her 3 brothers, Marcus, Dustin, and Scotty, and then her 2 grandparents, which were her mum's parents. And that means that there were 7 people in this house. So already it was definitely a bit more crowded than your typical living situation. And I think right off the bat, we get this very claustrophobic feeling from the way that Jennette describes growing up in this house, with them all really enmeshed in each other's personal space. Her family did struggle financially. She said that kind of the only reason they were able to live in the house is because her dad's parents had given them a really good deal on it. And even so, they still struggled with paying bills and everything on time. And that is with 3 adults in the household working full-time, and her granddad even working multiple jobs. So yeah, that's incredibly sad. And obviously, having 4 children in the house as well, that's going to be expensive. I can imagine grocery bills were super high. So she said that her family definitely had to work a lot to try and make ends meet. Now, her mum was the only adult in the home that didn't work. And part of this is because, as Deborah described, her main job was ensuring that Jennette makes it in Hollywood, but also Jennette and her 3 brothers were homeschooled. So I think this meant that Deborah would take on that kind of educating role and homeschooling them. And she did also pick up the occasional shift at Target, but really her main focus was on the children and getting Jennette to make it big. That was really her biggest goal in life. And when Jennette was only 2 years old, Deborah was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer, which was super scary. So I guess this could be another reasons for why she wasn't working. Now, of course, with this cancer diagnosis came a lot of medical bills, so I think this is kind of another reason why the family were struggling financially. And as you can imagine, it was an incredibly stressful and difficult time for everyone in the household. And Jennette says she kind of missed a lot of that because she was too young to remember it, and that her brothers have since filled her in on a lot of things that happened while her mum was, going through this diagnosis and working through treating her cancer. But Jennette herself doesn't have many first-hand experiences of it. Her earliest memories sort of start in the aftermath of that, when Deborah had started to recover and actually managed to battle her cancer. It was more that post-cancer life. So she doesn't have many memories from before Deborah was diagnosed and then seeing the change after, but she does say that her brothers have said there was a big shift in the entire home life following Deborah's diagnosis. And I guess one of the most notable changes is that Deborah became a hoarder. And Jennette thinks that this is partly because having such a near-death experience, or feeling, that she could really go at any time, meant that she hung on to possessions all the more tightly. So anything that Jennette and her siblings touched or used, Deborah wanted to keep because these became sentimental, valuable items for her. And so because of the hoarding, it just meant that the household got even more cramped, especially because you've got 7 people living in there, as I mentioned at the start. And so it got to the point where some of the rooms were actually unusable. They were just filled to the brim with stuff. It also meant that Jennette and her siblings were no longer able to access their bedrooms. And so they actually would sleep on the lounge floor on some gym mats because there wasn't enough space to have proper mattresses and beds. So yeah, that alone just broke my heart. Like, as someone who growing up really valued being able to escape into my bedroom and just get private time and alone time, have a comfortable bed, these are things that as a child you don't even realize how privileged that is, being able to do this. So the thought of not having a space in the home carved out for you and having to sleep in the lounge in such a public space in the home together with your siblings, and then not even on a proper mattress. I found this heartbreaking. Like, I know in the grand scheme of things, sleeping on the gym mat is like the least bad thing that she went through, but I don't know, I really felt for her in that moment. And Jennette also describes that because of her mum's cancer diagnosis, she really felt the need to prioritize her mum's wants and her mum's happiness above her own. The cancer could come back at any time, and this was kind of this like looming thing above Deborah and above the rest of the family as well. We could lose Deb at any time, so really we should prioritize her and her happiness. And Jennette definitely felt this and carried that weight with her. And this is really the catalyst for why Jennette didn't speak up or didn't feel like she could voice her true feelings, or, say to her mom, I don't want to be an actor, and really put her foot down on that, because at the end of the day, Jennette's thinking always came back to, oh, but like, we nearly lost mum, so now I really need to do everything that I can to make her happy. And Deb's experience with cancer was always very central to the family, and was something that Deborah herself would often bring up and talk about. Jennette writes in her book, Mum reminisces about cancer the way most people reminisce about vacations. She even goes so far as to MC a weekly rewatch of a home video she made shortly after learning of her diagnosis. Every Sunday after church, she has one of the boys pop in the VHS tape since she doesn't know how to work the VCR. All right, everyone, shh, let's be quiet. Let's watch and be grateful for where Mummy is now. And Jennette says her and her siblings were very uncomfortable rewatching this home video over and over again. I think she said it was a video of her mum, and she had no hair because she was going through chemotherapy, and she's gently singing lullabies to each of the children. So really quite a an intense and sad and very depressing video to be watching. Yeah, Jennette said her and her brothers were uncomfortable and didn't want to relive this dark time in their lives every single week. And so from that description, I almost get the feeling like, I wouldn't go as far as to say that she enjoyed having cancer. I think that's a crazy thing to say. But it seems almost like she maybe enjoyed the leverage it gave her. Man, this really makes her sound like a horrific person. But she is a horrific person. We know that from reading the book. So I wouldn't put it past her, but it almost seems like it was like this thing that she could leverage above everyone else in the home, and everyone has to be grateful for her, and everyone has to, follow her every whim, and no one can tell her what to do and what not to do because she battled this horrific experience. And so now this puts her in a position of power in the household. And so I think we also see how this diagnosis really altered all of the dynamics in the family. And I get it, because cancer is a horrific experience for anyone to go through. So I think it is completely valid that after experiencing something like that, you're going to be a different person. You're not going to just go back to being exactly the same that you were pre-diagnosis. And your family has also kind of been through it from a different lens. And so they're also not going to be the same people again, right? Everyone's going to be altered or different after going through a life-changing event. And your relationships with people will change, and your dynamics with them will change. All of this to me is like very unshocking and almost expected. But I think we can all agree that what Deborah's doing is like extreme, or like there's something not quite right there. Like, I don't think most people would relish in watching them during a dark time in their lives and getting their kids to rewatch that moment too. I don't think most people become hoarders after. Like, these are very different behaviors. Because the cancer was so central to Debbie's personality, and because Jennette was so scared of losing her mum, she always wanted to make her mum happy, even if this was at her own expense. And Deborah and Jennette were definitely very close. They would actually describe each other as their best friends. And Jennette was always with her mum 24/7. Deborah didn't work, and Jennette was homeschooled. So they really were together the entire day, every second of the day. And so Jennette's entire life and personality revolves around making her mum happy, to the point where every year her birthday wish, when she goes to blow out her birthday candles, is for her mum to live to see her next birthday. And I think this is obviously a very intense relationship for a child to have with their mum. But then I think it's made so much worse by the fact that Jennette never got a break. She never got to switch off from appeasing her mum, because they were never apart. And it gets to the point where, because her home life is so intense and rocky and cramped, and there's too many people living in the house and too many items living in the house too, Jennette describes that she loved attending church, and her family were part of the Mormon church. And Jennette says that those couple hours at church, they were like the highlight of her week, and she would get really stressed when her family was running late to get to church, because she wanted to be there for as long as possible. She writes, "I love the escape. Church is a beautiful, peaceful 3-hour reprieve from the place I hate most, home." Very sad. I mean, I totally get it, because I think other times when children have rocky home lives, school kind of becomes another sort of place for them, or a reprieve of their home life. And not being able to have like 6 hours a day where you're out of your home, I can imagine that would have been rough. So I see why she really liked going to church. Jennette said her mum became quite religious when she was diagnosed. I think they were always Mormon, but like they started going to church more frequently. Her mum got very involved in the, social clubs of the church. Jennette would go to the kids club type thing. And I think the other thing that's just very clear about Deborah is that she is not mentally well. And she never went to therapy herself, so she never got a professional diagnosis. But Jennette's therapists have estimated, based on information that Jennette's told them about Deborah, that she might have had bipolar disorder, narcissism, or borderline personality disorder, or a combination of all three. So there's definitely a lot going on there, and I can already, just from what we've covered, you can kind of see each of those things bleeding through, especially the narcissism with like enjoying people being sad about her cancer or enjoying everyone being grateful that she's still around. And then the other thing is that Deborah's mother, the grandma who also lived in the house, she also seemed to have some mental health issues that were very unresolved. So we have this pattern here, and Jennette describes that her grandmother was very emotionally intense, and any emotion she felt would be heightened times like 1,000. So if she was sad, she was wailing. If she was upset, she was furious, So they grew up in a very noisy household, and Jennette has said that as a result, her and her siblings were pretty quiet, or at least more reserved. There wasn't a lot of space for them to have emotional feelings themselves. And Jennette has since also cut contact, or at least has very limited contact, to her grandmother, and this is because her grandma really wasn't able to respect Jennette's boundaries. And Jennette did also hear from one of her brothers that their grandma was upset at the title of Jennette's memoir. And so because Deborah was struggling with her mental health, she would also make violent threats towards Jennette's dad, Mark, and have these really intense outbursts where she chased Mark around with a kitchen knife or some other kind of weapon that she would find. And these outbursts could be prompted by anything. So Jennette said that they were pretty frequent, and it could be something as simple as Mark coming home a bit later from work, which would cause Deb to think that he was cheating, and then a fight would break out. So these events were very commonly occurring in the household, and Jennette was very aware of what it looked like when someone is having an emotional outburst. And she actually describes a time where she has an audition where she has to act insanely angry and have kind of her character has an outburst, and she just mimicked exactly how her mum would act towards her dad, and she booked the role. And the casting directors were very impressed with how a young child was able to portray these really intense, mature emotions, right, and act them out so wonderfully. But I guess beneath that was, of course, this reality that to Jennette, these outbursts weren't foreign. They were something that she saw very often. So when Jennette is 6 years old, Deborah enrolls her into acting classes, and they start going to auditions. I don't know if I mentioned, but Jennette and her family did grow up in Southern California, so I think it was about a 1-hour drive for them to get to the Hollywood studios and stuff to do all these auditions. And as I mentioned, Jennette's homeschooled, Deborah doesn't work, so they really had a lot of time to attend things and practice their scripts and work on Jennette's acting skills. And initially, Jennette's brother Marcus was also going along to auditions, and Deborah was kind of trying to get both of them into acting. I think Marcus even managed to book a few minor roles here or there, and I think the general reaction from talent managers was that Marcus was the more natural actor, and they felt Jennette was just a bit stiff and awkward or a little bit shy, and that's probably a result of the fact that 1, she is 6 years old, and 2, she does not want to be there. I think once Jennette started to progress a little further into acting, Deborah focused all of her attention on Jennette. And Jennette says that her appearance was always a very big topic of discussion for Deborah, or a really big fixation for her, and Deborah would often swoon about her, big blue eyes and her gorgeous blonde hair. And so I think for Deborah, Jennette really had everything she needed to be a successful actor, and so she pushed a lot of energy into Jennette, which meant that Marcus kind of got to fly under the radar and eventually could stop acting. And I think it's pretty obvious from everything we've covered that Deborah really wanted to be an actress herself, but she blamed her parents' lack of support for the reason being as to why she never achieved this. And so for Jennette, she really wanted to be the complete opposite of that, where her parents never supported her wanting to be an actress. She was going to give Jennette every single opportunity to act. But of course, Jennette doesn't like acting. She says she actually has never liked it. The only things she liked about it is that it made her mum happy. She said she felt really shy, she felt awkward, she hated the audition process and was really uncomfortable with a bunch of adults in a room kind of judging her and people fixating on her. And I have to say, when I was reading this, I was like, audition processes must be really horrible for kids to go through. Just the constant rejection or being told you're too this or too that. People would talk about her right in front of her, casting directors would say oh no, she looks too pretty for the role, or oh, she looks too small for the role, oh, she's not tall enough for the role. So just this constantly being not enough, I mean, that's got to be terrible for a child's self-esteem. But as I mentioned, Jennette is prepared to do anything to keep her mum happy, and she describes it getting to a point where Deborah's feelings really blend with her own, to the point where Jennette finds it quite difficult to separate what she wants and what makes her happy from what her mum wants and what makes her mum happy. And Jennette was always very attuned to how her mum was feeling at any given time, and this is because Deborah would have very emotional outbursts over really benign things. Like, for example, when Jennette changed her mind over what her favorite flavor of ice cream is. And because Deb really wanted them to be close and, wanted them to know everything about one another, if there was ever something that Jennette changed her mind about or that she got wrong about Jennette's character, it would really upset her because they're meant to be thick as thieves. They're meant to know everything about each other. And Deb would often tell Jennette that Jennette was her best friend, which is of course very sweet, but I think again added to this pressure of Jennette needing to be very attuned to her mum's emotions and always feeling like it was up to her to make mum happy. And because Jennette was always hyper aware of how Deborah was feeling, she actually got to a point where she could tell Deborah's sort of telltale signs for how she was feeling, right? So if her mouth was in a specific position on her face, Jennette knew that Deborah was angry, or Jennette knew that Deborah was feeling hurt, and she just learned to pick up on like little eyebrow twitches, little movements of the mouth, which must be so stressful as a kid to have to hold all of that information in your brain, and just you can't really relax in an environment like that. But of course, because Deborah's outbursts were so intense and so sudden, Jennette learned to read the sort of early warning signs so she could quickly say something or do something that she knew would make her mum happy. And so despite not enjoying acting, Jennette was able to push through and started landing some minor roles in commercials and as extras, and then eventually also landed some speaking roles, which meant that she became like a principal cast member, and then she was able to work her way up from there. And of course, Jennette figures out that progressing in acting is something that makes Deborah feel better, and so we do see Jennette put a lot of pressure on herself to do well in auditions, because when she doesn't book a role, her mum is sad, so she would often pray for roles. Her and her mum together would pray to the Holy Spirit to give Jennette some new roles, and it became this very intense and all-consuming thing for her. And one of the reasons why Jennette was a desired child actor is because she took direction well and she didn't really get distracted, so this made her quite easy to work with in comparison to other kids. And of course, again, I think this is simply because for Jennette it wasn't just a fun little acting thing. It was like, if I don't do this well, mum will be upset and cry, so I'm just going to give it the best I can at all times. And then the other one of Jennette's key features was that she had a very convincing sad face and that she could cry on demand. And this was incredibly high value, especially for child actors. Her having a convincing sad face made me feel sad because I feel like that was just a genuine face. So because Jennette could cry on demand, which was very impressive, her mum would often make this known to any of the casting directors, and so this became like her thing that she was known for, or that she would get booked for. If they needed to cast a scene where a child had to cry, Jennette would often be someone they would turn to, because how ideal, we can get her to cry whenever we need. Jennette describes that crying on cue was emotionally demanding because the way that she would get herself to cry is she would imagine tragic events like her brother's dying, for example, so that she could produce the tears. She writes in her book, "It was one of the more miserable experiences of my life, sitting in a cold casting office, imagining tragic events that harm my beloved family." And her mum was, of course, constantly upskilling her and, pushing her to be a better actor as well. She enrolled her into acting classes, of course, but alongside that, Jennette also did various dance classes, and Deborah would practice audition scenes with Jennette quite intensely. As I mentioned, because of the homeschooling, her and Jennette could spend the entire week doing audition prep or running through scenes or practicing monologues. And at one point, Jennette describes that she was enrolled in 14 dance classes a week because one of the talent managers pointed out that Jennette was lacking a bit in the dancing capability. And this was definitely a pattern for Deborah. Anytime that Jennette got some kind of feedback or something that she wasn't quite good at, Deborah would push for Jennette to excel in that area and rectify the issue. So Jennette describes a time where she missed out on a commercial because she was unable to pogo stick. And so her mum immediately brought a pogo stick and had Jennette practice an hour a day for 2 weeks straight until she could do 1,000 consecutive jumps. So Deborah was incredibly intense with all this acting stuff. Jennette says that she kind of rationed this intensity in her mind as Deb just trying to be a good mum and, wanting Jennette to be the best actor that she possibly can be. And as I was reading this, I was starting to think man, I wonder what her brothers were up to during all of this, because obviously, 14 dance classes a week, that's just fucking madness. And then you're factoring in all the auditions that they have to drive an hour to get to. So I was really thinking there's no way that Deborah had much time for any of her other children when she was so consumed with Jennette. And so I looked a little into Jennette's brothers just to kind of see what their whole experience with this was. And I found a quote from her brother Dustin where he said that Deborah was definitely mentally abusive towards him and his father, but that he found some relief in Deborah's obsession with Jennette. He says, quote, "For me, having Jennette be the breadwinner, this is going to sound really selfish, but it kind of got our mum away from us. So part of me was more than willing to be like, oh, she's fine, take her out of the house for a while, that sounds great." So yes, I think although they were definitely being neglected and probably they would have felt maybe a little bit of resentment to the fact that Jennette was getting all this attention, I think ultimately they were just secretly pleased that it got Deborah off of their case. Now there is one moment that Jennette describes where she tries to tell Deborah that she doesn't like acting. This is after an unsuccessful audition sometime in the early 2000s, and Jennette says, "Mom, I really don't want to be an actor anymore." And Deborah says to her, "Don't be silly, you love acting. It's your favorite thing in the world." And then started to hysterically cry, which then meant that Jennette assured her she did actually want to keep acting and she never ever mentioned wanting to quit again. And then eventually, as Jennette books more roles and gets more paychecks, they are able to slowly declutter the house. Jennette actually manages to buy herself a bed, and so she's seeing the benefits of her continuing to act. And as Dustin mentioned, they were all secretly quite happy that she was the breadwinner, because she did make a lot of positive changes to the household, especially once she booked her series regular role on iCarly, which we will get into. But I think again, this similarly to Ariel Winter, who was also a breadwinner for her family because of her acting, how can a child ever voice that they don't want to do this thing that helps out their entire family? What child is going to go, "No, I've had enough"? They're feeling all of this pressure, and Jennette was well aware of the financial burdens. She would hear her mum crying to debt collectors on the phone, begging them for extensions to pay for bills, and so I don't blame her for just continuing to do this even though she doesn't want to. And I do also think part of why Jennette is able to act so well in auditions is because she kind of spends her whole life acting for her mom. There are definitely a lot of moments throughout the book where, as I've mentioned, Jennette describes analyzing micro facial expressions from Deborah so that she can act the right way. She says, quote, "I know all of Mum's expressions well. I have learned them inside and out so that I can behave accordingly at all times." And she also knows to watch what she says so that she doesn't accidentally ever set Deborah off. She describes a moment where she changed her favorite color. She says, quote, "I can't let Mum know I'm into the color purple, since Mum prefers pink. She would be heartbroken if I suddenly announced that I switched my favorite color to one that isn't also hers." So, yeah, God. It just sounds like a very stressful situation. Now, at age 11, Jennette develops OCD, although at the time she obviously doesn't know that this is what it is. She says at the time she thinks that the little voice she can hear in her head is the Holy Ghost, and that the Holy Ghost tells her to do all these random little things so that she can book auditions. And that's quite a typical symptom of OCD, right? Doing little tasks or rituals and things that you then connect with a specific outcome. So the Holy Ghost would tell her to tap her hand a certain way 5 times and then do 3 times another thing. And her granddad picks up on her doing some of these things, and he says to Deb, he thinks that Jennette might have OCD and that she should probably go and see a doctor about it, but Deborah ignores him and says that Jennette is perfectly fine. And this is kind of another thing that I'm sure people are wondering is, what were the other family members, especially the adults, thinking about the way Deborah was treating Jennette and Jennette's intense acting schedule? Because they all lived in the same home together, so they were definitely aware of it. And there are moments where Jennette describes her family kind of clocking the issues between her and her mom, but I don't think any of them ever actually did anything to intervene. And again, part of that could have been because no one really wanted to go against Deb. They wanted her to be happy. But despite this, Jennette does say that her dad Mark would often beg Deb to go to therapy, especially after she would chase him around with the knife. And, her granddad clocked the OCD. And her granddad also said to Jennette that she didn't have to act if she didn't want to. And she could just be a child if she doesn't want to do this acting thing anymore. So I think he recognized how much stress this acting schedule was giving Jennette. I do think that despite her granddad's words, you can stop acting if you want to, at that point, I don't think that she would have felt comfortable just stopping. When Jennette is 11 years old, this is when she develops an eating disorder. And she knows the exact moment that it all started because she remembers describing to her mum that she has lumps on her chest. And she was very concerned about these because obviously her mum has had breast cancer. And so, when she thinks of a lump, she thinks tumor. That's instantly where her mind went. And so she went to Deborah because she was very, very concerned. She showed Deborah the lumps on her chest, and Deborah says to her, like, oh no, those are just your breasts. Your breasts are coming in, they're developing. And Jennette was terrified. She was terrified of developing into a grown-up because she knew that her mom really liked her being young. And this is partly because, of course, being young means more opportunity in Hollywood. If you're a 9-year-old who can pass for a 6-year-old, that's amazing. You're going to book a lot of jobs because you're going to take direction better than a true 6-year-old. But she also knows that Deborah always talked to her about wanting her to be young and little and her little young daughter forever. And I think, again, this is partly because of that codependency and because of that control. And Deborah would often cry when she would think about, oh, well, when you grow up, we're not going to be close anymore because you won't need me anymore. And she would get quite upset at the thought of Jennette growing older. And so when Jennette finds out that she's entering puberty and is going to start maturing, she gets really worried. She wants to stay young. And she asks her mom, is there a way that I can prevent this or slow down the process? And she says her mom is very excited at the fact that Jennette wants to do this. And she says yes. And that is through calorie restriction. 11 years old. It's so horrific to me. And so Deborah teaches Jennette how to restrict her calories, how to be anorexic. And Deborah herself also struggled with eating disorders her entire life and was also herself anorexic. So the two kind of entered into this very toxic anorexic relationship where they would encourage each other to restrict their calories, and it was like this thing that they did together. And to Jennette, it was another way of making her mum happy. She writes, I proudly show my half-eaten portions to mum after every meal. She beams. Each Sunday she weighs me and measures my thighs with a measuring tape. And Jennette says that eventually she was weighing herself up to 5 times a day because 5 is her lucky number. Jennette says her and her mom really bonded over anorexia together, and it was just like this secret code that only the two of them knew that they were doing, and it was like a little special thing that only her and her mom did. She describes, calorie restriction has brought me and mum closer than we already were, which is really saying something because we were already so close. Calorie restriction is wonderful. We're about 6 months into our calorie restricting plan and you can really see the difference. I'm down 3 sizes and am now wearing a kid's size 7 slim. The Holy Spirit tells me to touch the word slim on my clothing tags 5 times a day because that ritual along with my restriction will keep me small. Thanks, Holy Spirit. In this we really see this blending of Jennette's OCD and her eating disorder and her mom, and it's just this whole clusterfuck of like emotions. It was pretty horrific to read about all this. Now, Jennette knew that her calorie restriction was like a special little thing between her and her mum, but she never really knew that there was something inherently wrong with restricting calories in this way until they went to the doctors. And Jennette recalls that at the time she was, I think, around 12 years old, and the doctor weighed her and she was 61 pounds, which is 27 kilos, so insanely light for someone her age. And so her doctor pulls Deb aside and voices concern about Jennette being underweight and asks Deborah, has she noticed any changes with Jennette's eating habits? And Deborah says no. And so Jennette knew this was a lie, because they'd very deliberately changed all of Jennette's eating habits. It was something that her mum monitored very closely. She weighed her 5 times a day. So the fact that her mum was lying to their doctor made Jennette realize, like, okay, there is something problematic about this behavior. But it didn't encourage her to stop or to question why her mum would put her through this. And again, I don't blame her for that, because she's 11 to 12 years old. She is so young. But I think it did make Jennette realize that this was something to hide. This is something that she shouldn't tell other people about. It was just between her and her mum. And at the doctor's office is the first time that Jennette hears the term anorexia. And the second time she would hear it is when one of the mums at her acting, or maybe at one of her dancing classes, I can't quite remember. But one of the other mums there tries to confront Deborah about Jennette's weight and says to her, like, maybe go see a doctor because anorexia is quite common for children in this industry. And Deborah dismisses it. And from this moment, when she first started her calorie restriction, is when Jennette's really long and difficult road with disordered eating started. She writes in her book, "The thinner I get, the stricter I get with what I'll ingest, because it seems like my body is trying to hold on to whatever I eat." So yeah, incredibly horrific experience. But again, Deborah was very open about wanting Jennette to stay young. And I think there's definitely a form of Deborah wanting to be needed by Jennette and wanting Jennette to be somewhat dependent on her, because there were a lot of things that Deborah did to kind of infantilize Jennette or to keep her dependent on her. So for example, Jennette describes that Deborah would wipe her after she went toilet right up until she was 8 years old, because Deborah convinced her that she wouldn't be able to do it right. And her mum would also shower her until she was about 17, again because Deborah was like, oh, it's your hair texture. If the texture of your hair was different, it wouldn't be so complicated to wash and you'd be able to do it yourself. And then also in the shower, she would give Jennette's bodies these like physical examinations, which was to check that there was definitely no cancer. And yeah, again, so deeply disturbing. Jennette also said that her mum would shower her brothers as well, and would also sometimes shower Jennette when she was around 11, together with her brother Scotty, I think it was, who was around 16 at the time. So just a really horrible experience. And Jennette said, her and her brother really didn't like this, and she could tell that they were both uncomfortable, but they would kind of both just not look at one another and dissociate. And Jennette has said that while her mother was showering her, she would picture being at Disneyland. Jennette describes an instance where her brother asked to shower himself, and it caused Deborah to start crying. So yeah, like I said, really quite clear that Deborah is trying to stunt how quickly her children grow up and find ways to kind of slow down the clock. And I do think this could be potentially tied in with the fact that there was this ticking time clock above Deborah, because her cancer could come back at any time. And as I mentioned, Jennette was with Deborah 24/7. She had very limited privacy, and this is such a constant throughout her upbringing, from the showering thing to the toilet thing to the no bedroom thing to the being homeschooled to her mum not having a job and always being there. And I think this does make her relationship with her mum and their codependency so consuming. When Jennette turns 15, this is when she is cast in iCarly as Sam Puckett on Nickelodeon. This is, of course, her breakthrough role. She describes the moment her and Deb found out that she had booked the role, saying, "I jump into Mum's arms. She squeezes me. I'm elated. Everything's going to be different now. everything's going to be better. Mom will finally be happy. Her dream has come true. And as I mentioned, Jennette was a series regular starring alongside Miranda Cosgrove, who played Carly. And in the show, her character Sam and Miranda's character Carly, they host a web show together titled iCarly. And Sam's character is described as being a tomboyish, sarcastic, aggressive girl. And as a result of her behavior, she frequently gets into trouble. She has a butter sock, which is a sock filled with butter that is swung around as a weapon. Sam is also portrayed as lazy, as she often avoids doing work unless forced to. Despite her flaws, she is really a kind person who cares deeply for her friends. So Jennette's character, I think, was really a foil for Miranda Cosgrove's character, which was a bit more the sensible, everyday, normal type, and then Sam was the funny comedic relief, the edgier one, I guess. And I would say the fan favorite, or at least she was my favorite character in the show, because she really is the comedy. So getting this role was huge for her. And then the other interesting thing about Sam Puckett's character is that she has an obsession with food. And I pulled this quote from the iCarly Wikipedia, the fandom fan page website, whatever. It says, "Perhaps the most prominent trait is Sam's immense appetite and love for food." And Sam is always depicted eating something on the show, or being hyperfixated on food, or trying to find food, pulling fried chicken out of her purse or whatever. This is really the key central characteristic of Sam Puckett, which is of course so ironic because, as we know, Jennette McCurdy at the time was really struggling with a heavy eating disorder. So I do think there was something kind of twisted or ironic in Jennette portraying this character as well. Booking this role is really where everything changes. Jennette has fans now. She goes on red carpets and talk shows, and she's really made it. As she said, Deborah's dream has come true. Her family don't have any financial worries anymore. They can pay all the bills on time, and she's really gotten Deborah her happily ever after. But meanwhile, Jennette is continuing to struggle, and she's in a really, really dark time of her life. And she does talk about some of the key moments from her experience being on Nickelodeon. But this is where we will end part 1, and we will continue with those in the next episode in part 2. So that is all from me for this episode. Don't forget to rate and review the podcast if you enjoy the show. Please feel free to leave a written review or comment. I love my words of affirmation. And you can follow me on socials at Mood for Feud. If you'd like to buy me a coffee, I have a link in the show notes, and all funds will go towards upgrading my podcast gear. I hope everyone is crushing their goals this week, and of course, keeping out of trouble. Don't get into any feuds, and I will talk to you all next week. Bye!